So, crazy bump I wanted to show you. I forgot to show you before the break there, but it kind of does the same thing that the Photoshop shadow highlight tool will do. What crazy bump is designed to do really is kind of quickly process different layers for what would be a typical texture in a 3D environment. There's a bunch of different types of programs like this out there. I just found out about another one, which I'll show you. I don't really know much about it yet, so I can't really show you the details, but Crazy Bump can be good for kind of processing files for the shading and highlight issue, right, to sort of take out that shading and highlight. So I'll go to my textures folders. I've got the original here, the stone wall. So I'll just load that up to sort of compare it to Photoshop and how it works. So it's going to take a second for this thing to kind of load up and process. Puny humans are instructed to wait. So what it kind of does is it sort of analyzes the shapes and surfaces in a photograph and will kind of generate or simulate a real 3D surface, or it tries to kind of replicate one. So in this case it looks like the bricks and stone are protruding, so I'm going to select this one. For this exercise it's not super important, but the cool thing is you'll see a preview of what this might look like in a 3D software. And if I go to options, you can see with a diffuse texture on top, it'll look super realistic, right? If you right click and drag, you can see how the lighting interacts with the surface. So a lot of surface detail in video games, movies, TV shows, a lot of it, instead of it actually being modeled, is actually kind of faked and simulated via things like normal maps. We'll get into that in a few projects, but I mainly want to use this tool. Let's do the little ambient occlusion. But yeah, I usually will mainly use this tool to do a little bit of quick color correcting to start. So there's, again, kind of a cool preview of the texture, right? But let's just move this off. So as I said, there's the normals, which we can play with. We're not going to do that now. There's displacement. Again, I just want to move past this. Really, I'm focusing on the diffuse. The diffuse is basically our kind of base color layer. That's really another term for the flat color, or the main color component of our materials is a diffuse map. Now this thing has really just a bunch of little sliders at the bottom here, diffuse. So you see remove shading, right? Watch what happens when I crank that. Right? Does a really, really good job, right, of neutralizing those shadows. So sometimes I'll do this as a very quick first pass. I'll save it out from here and then load it into Photoshop. But the techniques I use in Photoshop are giving me almost the same result. So, you know, if you don't want to mess with adjustment layers and masking and selecting and all that, that can help. Now, removing highlights does darken the image, as you see, but the overall tone now is much more even. Okay, so I may not crank it all the way for remove highlights, but I may just bump it up a bit. So again, it's a bit like the shadow highlight tool, right? There's 3D crevices. Again, if I crank it, you'll see it actually exaggerates the shadows, which I don't want. 3D highlights, which will kind of boost up or blast the lighter areas, which again, I don't really want. So I'll bring that back down to 0. Typically, these last 3 sliders I will just sort of leave alone, and there's color correction. So again, it's sort of bringing back too much contrast in the shading, which I want to avoid. So I'm just going to leave pretty much everything but remove shading. And again, you can just click on the little save button and save this to a file. Sometimes if I don't want to create extra files, I'll just say copy diffuse to clipboard. So it may take a second or two. You'll see it's kind of working a bit, but it's going to store this in RAM, and then I can literally just go into my Photoshop file, and if I just click here and hit Control V, it'll paste the copy into my current scene. Right, so it's not too shabby, but I think the results I got in Photoshop are a little bit better. Again, I could still go through the same process, so I could use kind of the best of both tools and still go back in and do a shadow highlight sort of retoning. Let's see, preview on, thank you. There we go. Just crank that. So let's just kind of compare. Yeah, it's not too bad. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to just kind of quickly run through another example. So, well, maybe not actually. Yeah, I'll just stick with this one for now. So what I want to do is basically make this thing able to repeat and tile inside of Maya eventually. So the way to do that is to so what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer. Now in this case I've got the adjustment layer, I've got a couple of extra things going on above my base texture that I've edited. Okay, so what I want to do is create a kind of snapshot of what's completely visible at the moment. So I'm going to hit Alt Control Shift E. It's one of the longest shortcuts you're going to get. Alt Control Shift E. All right, so when I do that, it's going to create a new layer, right? Kind of a flattened version of what was happening below. Now at this point, what I like to do is kind of start storing the old work files in a folder. So I'm just going to go and click on the little folder icon at the bottom. I'll just call it old layers, let's say, is fine. Old layers. I'll just left click and drag that below my top snapshot, and I'll drag these two layers into that folder. Will they drag in? Come on, let's go. For some reason they will not. That's okay. Another thing you can do, for whatever reason, oh, I think I know why. My base layer, as you can see, whenever you open an image or create a base layer inside of Photoshop, it automatically locks the first layer. So to unlock that, you can kind of just double click on the little lock icon or click on it once and it should free it up. So yeah, I could try to drag this stuff in now to my group layer. Come on, Photoshop. So yeah, let's just move this above. So I'll grab these two layers, just drop them into the group, and I'll call that, again, old layers. So what's great about this is I can now kind of just switch this off and focus on what my kind of current stage of the texture. So next up, I want to make a square of this because, like I said, most of our textures want to being worked on in a square fashion. So if I want something that's square and repeatable, I'm going to have to crop this thing. So I can just click on C to crop, which is this little icon on the left-hand side. And what I like to do is at the very top, again, there's options for the crop tool. So I'm going to type in 2048 px for pixels, and I'll just go to the other side, 2048 px. So I'm automatically going to get the correct texture size when I crop this thing. Now, as a general rule, it's always a good idea to crop a little bit inside the image. So we don't want to go to the very, very edge of this image. The reason being is that sometimes you get color distortion at the outer edges of your picture frame. Sometimes there's other distortions caused by camera lenses and things of that nature. So now I'm kind of choosing this wall. It's a little more difficult than a straight brick wall, but if I had a regular brick wall, what I'd want to do is typically at the very top, I want to just grab the top edge of one row of bricks. At the bottom, I'd want to just get the grouts, which is the stuff in between the bricks, right? So in this case, I'm going to try to look for a natural straight line to kind of crop very, very close to. So let's say you guys hopefully can see that little line at the bottom, right? So this will allow things. I'm doing roughly the same thing at the top. So I want to just kind of find a natural line or gap somewhere where I can hopefully create a more seamless repetition, both horizontally and vertically. So cropping and placement, I think if you do this right and pay special attention to this, is actually going to help speed up your editing in Photoshop. So I'm going to hit enter. Okay. So I've got my new version of the texture. Now, I'm going to duplicate this layer. I'll explain why in a second. So you can do this one of a couple ways. You can basically click on this little palette icon on the right side and go to duplicate layer. That's one way, which works. When it doesn't, I don't know. Come on, Photoshop. Yeah, it's been really strange. Yeah, have you guys noticed Photoshop issues the last few days? Yeah, it's been a little weird recently. Okay, I'll try that one more time. Or maybe, other way to do it is to left click and drag the layer to the new layer icon. Oh, I see. Yeah, my pop-up is actually showing up on the other monitor, so I'm not seeing it, but I'll just say OK. Another way to duplicate, like I said, is just left-click and drag to the new layer, and it sort of just generates that duplicate. So you might wonder, why duplicate the layer? Well, what I'm going to do is actually go into View, sorry, not View, Filter, Other, and then go to Offset. So what does offset do? Well, it literally pushes the image off to one side. Now by default, I think this might be set to 0 and 0. Or you might have a number like this, where it's offsetting on the horizontal and vertical. Typically, what I like to do first is process the horizontal. So this image is 2048 pixels, right? So I'll typically go 1024. Oops, 1024. There we go. I was having this issue earlier. It's kind of not quite centered, but you see this line is here, right? So there's that kind of hard line which breaks the illusion that we actually have a natural repeating sort of stone pattern, right? So if I turn this off, I've got the layer below. Okay. So here's the magic trick. I'm going to just simply go in. I'm going to hit M, which is the marquee tool, and I'll show you that's just on the left-hand side here. So I'm going to select just over that area, right, kind of on either side of this hard line, and then I'll click on Layer Mask. So that's going to basically punch a hole through that layer to the layer below. Okay. Now, in fact, what's happening is this white line, you can see that, right? That white line, it's actually showing this gap still, which I don't want. I want to hide the gap, so what I'm going to do is just flip this around. So I could go to Image, Adjustments, and Invert. Now, keep in mind, you have to select, left-click on the layer mask and make sure it's selected. I wish Photoshop was better at this. They should have like a bright pink border around it or something so you really know it's selected. But Image, Adjustments, Invert. I always use the shortcut, which is Control-I. Okay. So watch what happens. Watch the black and white box. Control-I will flip that around. Right. Now, if you did this on the actual color layer, you'll get something like this. It'll flip the colors around, which we don't want to do. But so I have an even worse problem now, right? I'm seeing two lines instead of one, right? So here's the kind of little trick. First of all, on the left-hand side where the little color swatches are, there's the black and white. If they're a different color, I think you can hit X and you can hit D and it'll reset them to black and white. So sometimes you'll have, if you're painting something else, you might have a pink color and a blue or whatever. But if you hit D, it automatically switches to black and white. And X will allow you to flip back and forth. So the black will be the foreground color, which is your main paint color, or the white will be X, back and forth. Okay. So why is this important? Well, what I'm going to do is paint what's essentially called a junk mask. So I'm going to just click on my sort of empty space around the image, hit B for brush, and I'm just going to right click and find a kind of rough, since this is kind of like stone, brick, whatever, I like to go with kind of a rough sort of brush, which will allow me to blend things really nicely when I create these little transitions. So I'm just going to click here. Again, I'm painting on this mask area, so I'm going to make sure I'm painting in black. And let me just zoom in a little bit. So I'm going to Control plus to zoom in. So watch what happens. So I'm not painting on the image. I'm painting in this layer mask. So as I paint, let me change the opacity. I usually work at 100% opacity for this sort of stuff. So let's just take down the brush size a bit. Okay, so now I can help kind of heal out those, right? That straight line by actually, and this is what's happening. I'm just painting a junk mask. That's literally what we call it in the industry. It's just kind of a rough, kind of crappy paint job. But because I'm blending between these two layers, right, I can get a nice bleed between different edges, different bricks, right? You guys see that? So that's how we get a seamless repeating texture. We do this once horizontally, and I'll essentially apply the same technique vertically. Now, usually in the beginning, I'll literally just kind of hack through this and just kind of quickly go over this. But a lot of times what will wind up happening is I'll fine-tune this. So I'll kind of just break up the edge so it's not a perfectly straight edge because your eye will be drawn to that. So I'll just kind of quickly knock this in. And there we go. Then I'll sometimes alternate between... By the way, when you want to preview this mask, layer masking thing, you have to Alt left click on it, and it shows you the preview of what that mask looks like. So to click back on the texture to see the actual texture layer, we'll left click on it once, and then I'll just left click on the layer mask again so I can paint it. So I'll flip. Using X, I'll flip back and forth to say, you know, let's add a little bit here, subtract a little bit there. And that's kind of it. It's sort of a little bit of a finessing process. So I'm just trying to find edges that sort of work together. So let me flip again. Let's see, X, yeah. So, yeah. So sometimes I'll kind of flip back and forth a bit until I get something that really, really works. There we go. Right, so you guys kind of see that, right? And that's the mask. It's kind of amazing. So, and I'll just kind of pop this little stone back in, that little gap, right? So that's really how we kind of heal that hard line, right? So you see it's really starting to work here, yeah? So you guys maybe want to try that for a little bit.